One of the things I love about conversations is having conversations who can see the beauty in our world in a different way than I'm accustomed to. And it was this really nice introduction to the beautiful complexity of our world that I thought was just really beautiful. So we have on our panel people who are looking at similar things, but all from different perspectives. So Dr. Jeff Hardin, of course, you're welcome to grab any of the seats that you would like. Elizabeth Littauer-Bassett as well, also part of our conversation, or part of our community. She is an assistant. Am I doing something weird with my mic? Oh. Okay. Better? Okay, thanks. So Elizabeth is an assistant biosafety officer at one of our local universities, and she focuses on biomedical research and safety compliance, but has 10 years or over 10 years experience working on respiratory infections, bacterial immunology, and vaccine development. So all this brilliance we have in our midst. Shireen Kelly, hopefully if you don't know her, you should, actually everyone up here. Shireen is in academic pediatrics in the Philadelphia area. And one of the things I'm really excited about to get her perspective on is when we move from cells to the actual children. Like, what are some of these complex ethical decisions that need to be, or elements that need to be involved in the conversation? And then Dick Landis. And your bio, although I know things just personally, I went to go read your bio and I didn't understand half the words that were on the bio, but is recently semi-retired, because he's not actually retired, as the senior vice chair of the Department of Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Informatics at Penn. And I think, is Penn the third time that you were the founding director of a division of biostatistics? So like three founding director positions, so kind of amazing. And with Dick, I'm really excited to hear from you about what kind of oversight is necessary, the conduct for clinical research studies, and then transparent displays of that data, what you find out. And here I'm reminded of, I went to undergrad for business, and when I was doing my like informal just kind of get to know the university kind of thing. I was in a classroom with an accountant who said, you know you are a really good accountant when you can tell your CFO, what answer do you want me to come up with? And then as the accountant, you come up with the information. So I think about this sometimes when I'm thinking of statistics even, like it seems like it should be objective because it's numbers. But sometimes I wonder if there's a changing, a shifting, or a manipulation of the data. So thank you. So we have research, we have medical, working with children and people and data, all to enter into this conversation. So I would like to start maybe with the three of you just talking about maybe your reflections on what you heard Jeff speak about and how maybe there's complementary conversations in your own field of expertise. So Elizabeth, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you because you do the research.
Yeah, I think if we're coming from like where we're going to start from like basic molecular research, and then the research that I did was vaccine development and sort of studying the fundamentals of viruses, respiratory viruses. And then now I work in an oversight capacity at our local university. Looking especially at, you know, what are researchers doing? How are they manipulating different components of the biological world? How can we support them in doing safe research? And then also facilitating compliance with the NIH, the FDA, the CDC, PA, Department of Health, OSHA. There's a huge list. So we both provide support for that. A thought that I immediately had was to be able to respond to what Stephen was mentioning, like what prevents what prevents a billionaire from creating, his own designer children. People can be bought, for sure. I do think that once you go over a certain edge, you're not particularly welcome back into the community of scientists. I think a thing that's exciting for me about Jeff coming has been just seeing the level of academic discussion that you brought, and that really reflects like my training over the last 10 years, Dick's training over, I won't put a number to yours, but
the Jeff Hardin School of Chronology.
The Jeff Hardin School of Chronology is what you just said. But the academic community is composed of people at a whole range of training. It's not just the couple famous scientists and like a few bad actors. It's your trainees, it's your graduate students, your undergraduate students, your postdocs. It's a very international community. So when you see a bad actor, what I would call a bad actor, somebody who edits genomes and then carries that to full-term pregnancy and delivery, the outcry was enormous. And that person went into hiding for a while. That person, anybody who collaborated with that person was under scrutiny. And so there's that component of collegiality and transparency that's very important in academic research. And those academic research partnerships also translate into biopharmaceutical as well. So I think that can't be overestimated, and then also, or underestimated. And I also think so many funding agencies also put stipulations. So like if your institution receives NIH funding, the entire institution has to be compliant with NIH policies regarding gene editing, certain types of experiments with influenza, SARS-CoV-2, SARS, MERS, these sorts of things. So that's sort of where my niche is now, is evaluating how we fit as an institution and what our institutional risk and values are, sort of in the framework of like taxpayer-funded ventures. I'm gonna go to Dick because then you are. Well, I was going to say, we can go to data analysis, like data, how is the data gathered? Data analysis, application of data. Does that make sense?
Oh, good.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be here, and especially thanks to Jeff for such an revealing set of slides and a tremendous framework for which to address this. So I guess the question well, maybe I should say a few more things about my background in terms of one correction, since I know we're being recorded. The founding director of epidemiology and informatics are two different people. My role was in biostatistics, but we all work together. And that is one of the beautiful things about being in the statistical and data side of things is you get to work in everyone else's field. And it means you get to learn what they're doing, but also importantly, why they're doing it. And so I've come to, at this stage of life, to think a lot more about why we're doing it and where we're going, and the Christian framework that I bring to it. I'm thinking of Henry Nouwen's comment that we spend a lot of time in our life preparing for questions that will never be answered, that will never be asked of us. And the question of what did you do with your life, and what should we be doing with our life, from the Matthew 25-24 perspective of the questions we will be asked. I keep coming back to, what did you do for the least of these? And so I'm more and more over these years involved in studies where we're looking at the health disparities and the issues that affect large populations. and especially large populations that are involved in ways that we could do something about. And so I'm really interested in, back to your work, Jeff, in terms of the questions we might ask about how do we decide what we should be doing in addition to the areas where the science leads us. But I'll leave it at that. And
good morning, everyone. So I have probably the most wonderful job of watching children grow up and trying to enhance the health of the population that I serve, which is North Philadelphia. So as I was sitting here listening, first of all, I'm not an expert, same thing. I also went to medical school a long time ago, and we didn't talk about this because it wasn't a thing. But as I sat and listened, I was compelled to offer just briefly the environmental balance to the genetics side. And a lot of what I grapple with every day is the environment that a child is born into and grows up in. So I also have a wonderful job of training young physicians. So I'm going to give all of you some homework. One of just some things to look up to inform this part of the discussion. And obviously this is a different discussion, so I'll just say it briefly and then we can talk about it later. But the Adverse Childhood Events Study carried out by Kaiser in the 1990s really shows us that if children experience trauma, they could have a beautiful genome, but they're going to have bad health outcomes. One of the foremost researchers that you should read is Nadine Burke Harris, who also looks at how a child's brain reacts to trauma. And again, you might have the absence of disease in your life, but if you're reacting to trauma, you will not develop in the same way neurologically. So I commend her reading to you. And then because it's so important and it's Advent, some of those discussions are really, they feel very heavy because we do have children growing up in environments that are not conducive to health and wholeness. So my last assignment is to look up the Harlem Children's Zone, because there's an effort that's community-based that's actually addressing and enhancing health and wholeness of children. So again, this is not the discussion about environment. I will say the way that Jeff's work touches what I do every day is in the realm of newborn screening. So we get a lot of data about a baby when they first come to our practice, and we talk every day about what does this mean in your life. It's not as detailed as obviously a genome reading, but we do a lot of sort of helping families understand that. And then the second way that this impacts what I do every day has a lot to do with birth control for teenagers, right? Because there's a lot of implications for genetics and when does the embryo become human, or, you know, where are those lines drawn? So I don't have the answers to any of these things, but I would commend that you read a little bit about the environment as well, just because I think this technology is awesome, but we will not win the battle with just this technology. We have to fix the environments that our families are growing up in. So that's my heartbeat. I don't want to derail the genetics conversation, but I did pass the class in medical school, but it's all changed. So don't ask me any expert questions.
I'd just like to piggyback off of this. This actually gets to I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but your question earlier about 23andMe and those kinds of services. One thing we didn't talk about there was this an excessive thinking that that leads to an overemphasis on genotype, on genetics, because organisms clearly are, they have genomes. This clearly influences us as human organisms, but our interaction with the environment is absolutely crucial. So I think that is something I didn't touch on, but I'm glad you mentioned it, because there can be the sense that it's all we need to think about are genes all the time, and that's just not the case. And I'm in a department, integrative biology used to be called zoology, where I have lots of my ecology friends will talk to you at great length about how, hey, genes are important, but it's the genes interacting with the environment that leads to phenotypes, what an organism is and what it looks like.
On that note, following up those 2 points, my newest project is health disparities in the rural South in 10 counties. NIH has funded a long-term cohort study where they're bringing in their drinking water. We're collecting data on where they get their food, how far they have to drive for health care, all the social determinants of who they're connected to in their lives. Do they have people in their lives? And all those kinds of things. So part of what is a redeeming kind of thing for me is to feel like science is moving in this multidimensional area to realize that we were created as whole people, and the aspects of what affects who we are and how we function. And one of the most favorite words from the hour lecture is human flourishing. I keep coming back to the biblical framework of tending the garden and the fact that the garden is intended to flourish, which means we have to figure out what we can do to help human flourishing in all those aspects.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of coming from all, but I think one of the big questions was like, where do we bring our Christian perspective? And I think it is one of those underlying values of protection of the weak. And I think society reasonably has critique for the scientific endeavor because of because of the ways that we have not protected the weak, where we have let our curiosity or worse, our ambition, especially throughout really the turn of modern medicine in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of using prisoner populations, minority communities that are under-resourced in medical aid, so you can hold sort of like participation in a study has like the effort to receive medical care. And so you kind of deferred your expertise on genetics, Shireen, but I actually think like, yeah, your expertise is really central to this because it's easy to sit in a very controlled environment and say, if you fix this one gene, look at all these amazing results that you have. But you actually have to like take that into the real world. I think another space where it's extremely, protection of the weak is also like listening to who we would consider the weak. I have several friends who have disabilities, and my younger brother has autism. And I have sat through a few seminars and papers before where scientists, we want to play up, like, my research is so important because these people's lives are awful. And those folks would speak right back and go, my life is not awful. What I experienced does not hurt. Like, I want you to figure out how to, like, get my headache to go away or take a pill to get rid of the cold. Like, I don't want you to fix my deafness. I don't want you to fix the way my brain works differently. I think it's extremely important to have those voices, not just in our trials and studies, but also at our research benches and our data analysis computers and at our funding agencies.
I have a question. I think my mic's still on. Yeah. I have a question just about the, as people are considering ethical ramifications of any particular study or environment, who's doing the deciding? Like, who is actually saying this needs to be fixed? Because that to me, when we pair that with the humanity being the fallible nature of humanity, always makes me wonder, in the ethical decision making, who gets to say what is broken, what is fixed, what is preferable? Because I would imagine that probably changes even as we go around the world.
one part of one part of the answer is the sponsor of this study. We have studies now where we have patients on the advisory board. So the advisory board at the steering committee meetings turns to the patients in the audience and says, does this sound reasonable to you? With the condition, is this something that you would be willing to sign up for? One study is on opioid taper, where patients on hemodialysis also have lots of pain. And so one of the reasons they're doing this study is how can we taper them off of opioids onto something that's still effective pain control, but also in a way that their human dignity and integrity and everything is intact. So how you do that study by showing up in a hemodialysis unit and start asking them all kinds of questions is something bigger than simply the study of how to taper off of opioids. So I do think the sponsors are getting much more attuned. Just yesterday, I got a request to be on a 2-day workshop for how to address health disparities in kidney treatment, because even the GFR that you get for your kidney function has a term in there for whether you're Black or not. And if you're Black, the coefficient is different, and your GFR value is actually different than if you were white with exactly the same kidney function. And so when you get treated and when it crosses that threshold is actually one of the, small, but there's lots of other factors that are in play. So health disparities are quite diverse, but I do think the sponsors are not the only ones who should be making the decision.
I will say that in medical education, there's a realization of some of the disparities in how money is spent in research. For example, there's a lot more money spent on cystic fibrosis research in children than there is on sickle cell anemia, and those affect 2 different populations. I think in medical education, in medical schools, for sure right now there's an effort to look at things that have traditionally been accepted, like the GFR thing, kidney function. What ends up happening is that individuals of certain races get put lower on a transplant list because their evaluative numbers are different. And so now that some of these things are out into discussion in the medical world, I think there will be a lot of changes over time, but it's long overdue.
I just can't emphasize enough how important the trainees right now are really are. I would say that the age group that I've come up with, the cohort is fairly diverse. And then, once you start to get into those positions of power, it still tapers off. It's the faculty, the faculty are seem to be majoritarily white males. And, it's a bad sign when I'm the diversity on some committees. That's not good. Yeah, I think empowering, the talent is absolutely there and the talent is ready. I know of several talented Black scientists in our church who just are so busy with their careers right now that they can't come, which is great. So it's not a condition of, there just isn't anybody there. No, I think you should promote people. I do think you should promote people who obviously have the skill, and also the viewpoint and the lived experience. That's absolutely, I think, should be a factor in how we are building our medical schools, our biopharmaceutical companies, our regulatory agencies, and our funding agencies.
If I could, I'm sorry, Jeff. If I could ask a question to Jeff, we're both in academic institutions where communication of what we do is so critical. how much do you attribute to polarization about the vaccine now, and especially the large numbers who are not comfortable receiving the vaccine, to the fact that, an earlier point, that scientists don't communicate well enough what they're doing and how they're doing it, and what are the things that the public need to understand? I'm interested in maybe a comment or two that you might have on that.
First of all, I just want to say, I think GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate. Is that how your kidneys work, by the way? So I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV either. So I think public communication by scientists is crucial. We talked about this a bit with genome science. Certainly true with regard to vaccination and the pandemic. I'm on the board of something called the BioLogos Foundation, which was founded by Francis Collins. BioLogos has spent a lot of time recently trying to help educate Christian audiences about vaccination, about transmissibility of COVID-19, those kinds of things, how mutations, that's a genetics topic, but it affects how these viruses work and how they're transmitted, and how much disease symptoms they cause, those kinds of things. But I would say we're overall not doing a great job. Scientists as a bunch, most of us are kind of introverted. I teach undergraduates, which forces me out of my shell a bit. Otherwise, I get crucified on my end of semester teaching evaluations. So I've learned to communicate a bit. But it's hard for us to tone down our language sufficiently well so that you get the gist of what the issues are without having to know anything about the technical details. That takes great skill and patience. I'm involved with the dialogue on science, ethics, and religion, or DOSER, through the American Association for the Advancement of Science. That program's headed by Jennifer Weissman, who's a Christian astronomer, involved with the Hubble Space Telescope. But, one of the things that's clear there is that, and the DOSER is working really hard to do, is to connect religious communities with scientists. And vice versa, connect scientists with religious communities. So the traffic needs to be both ways, but where the starting point in your route affects your route. So that's why we need things going in both directions. And I think one of the things that has been very valuable there is helping non-religious scientists, and they're the majority of scientists actually, they would not profess to have a religious affiliation, helping them to appreciate how important religious commitments are to the average person. So if something's important to a scientist, and that involves federal funding, let's say, and that means tax dollars from the average human, they need to be able to communicate why their branch of science is important to a person who often has religious motivations, and in my case, Christian communities are really important. So I think there is a little bit of recognition of that, but I think the pandemic has really unmasked, the need for better two-way traffic between religious communities and scientists. It's not helpful for a scientist to say, you couldn't possibly understand all of the issues in play here. You just have to trust me. Trust is built, and it's built over a long period of time, and it's built in relationship. And that means that scientists need to be willing to do the kind of thing that we're doing here, right this morning. It takes time away from other things that you might be doing, but to me, this is incredibly valuable. And for me, a lot of the work that I have tried to do is to communicate with Christian audiences to help them to see the importance of these things. There's a lot of ideological factors in play in get vaccinated, don't get vaccinated. There's a lot of libertarian threads to this discussion. Wisconsin's an interesting state. It's kind of like Pennsylvania. You get out of the major urban areas into rural areas, and there's a huge change in how people think about vaccination, the percentage of vaccinated people, all kinds of things, whether we need to wear these devices over our nose and mouth. That's complicated. I think what I hope is that we do a better job of building trust in the future.
I also want to just emphasize, like, yeah, I think it's easy to talk about the scientific community and the religious community as both being very monolithic. Whereas, like, there's a huge diversity of people who are in science, and that we all come from very specific, like, very different backgrounds, you know, like, you can come from, like, Western North Carolina, like, grew up, you know, evangelical background, or you can have someone who grew up, you know, you have people who came from Paris, or people who, you know, came from, like, have these really amazing stories of coming from either very affluent backgrounds in China or very rural backgrounds. You know, also, I'm thinking of exact lab mates I've had, and they're all in the same lab. And we talk about things over break, you know, like lunchtime, and people have beliefs. It's just, I think specifically with science, we set those beliefs and identities aside, maybe less so than we would if we were in a different academic field or a different line of work. We just embrace, like, a common language of data and procedure and protocol and experiments. But I think not to underestimate the backgrounds of both communities, you know, where, like, science has really informed Christian faith in some ways. I think Uda mentioned, like, the intense curiosity. That's profoundly human and profoundly, like, God-given. Yeah, I think visualizing it as groups of people who really care, not just about what they're doing, but also about each other. Yeah.
I also think just because a scientist isn't a Christian doesn't mean they're our enemy at all. There are a lot of scientists who have the type of values that I would call kingdom values. They are profoundly dedicated to wholeness and health and to the betterment. And so we can't see those people as the enemy just if they don't share our faith in the same way. I think the church does tend to silo itself, even in some social actions, when there are amazing things that we can jump into and add our effort and our money and our time to, that actually bring shalom on earth. In a way that maybe isn't spoken with Jesus' name, but still brings that measure of peace and fulfillment. So I think we would all probably say that you need to work with the people who are like-minded. Some will share your faith and some won't, but even if they don't share your faith, there's a lot of really excellent work happening in health and in science by other people other than just believers.
Yeah, I'd like to say two things there. So I agree with that, but I think Christians have two things to offer. One is our unique perspective on what it means to be human that I was touching on during my talk. But we have to be able to interact with people outside of the church. So we have to be able to interact with our colleagues in the public square in ways that they can understand and in ways that don't put us into silos and prevent us from interacting. And actually, the nature of the church itself ought to help with this. You know, our fundamental identity as Christians is that we are, to use Paul's phrase, which he uses over and over again, and maybe most prominently in Ephesians, in Christ. Romans 6 says we've been baptized into his body. That's our fundamental identity. And the book of Galatians, if it teaches us anything, is that this transcends all of the identity categories we might think about. Our fundamental identity is that we are Christ followers, but not only that, we are part of his body, and we ought to be linked together organically. So the church ought to model some things about transcending fractious kinds of discourse. We ought to be able to talk to one another. Now, I mean, to be honest, I think we failed a lot of times in that quest, but I pray that it might be true that we would be able to communicate with one another and model what civil discourse looks like, and then face outwards and engage in discourse for the common good. So that's I think, an aspiration maybe, but I think a worthwhile one as a Christian.
Sorry. We are over time, and I just want to be mindful of your time, the fact that you came at a set time. So I want to make sure you have the freedom to like get up and go anytime that you need. But I would like to ask if there's anyone, if there's anyone who is here who has a burning question, I'd like to give another opportunity for that to happen.
I can understand. Say that.
Yes, sorry. I got distracted with the mic. I thought I was on.
If you have a burning question, I think Cyndi said, please feel free to ask that right now.
Perhaps one of the statistical people will look at this question. In the past, it was said that the majority of bench scientists in the United States were farm boys. And I'm wondering if that's, when that shifted, how that shifted, if that did shift, because you're talking about the diversity in labs. But could it possibly be something that liberates the children of the United States to become researchers, to move 4-H into the urban contexts and into the more diverse contexts, so that kids have an experience of watching the life of plants and animals over many, many years as a foundation for some of this work later on. And one other last thing is there anybody who's sitting on boards of education and saying, thou shalt teach trigonometry to 11th graders, or thou shalt be considered doing STEM malpractice against the children who have to cope with calculus with trigonometric values in their freshman years, or get thrown out of science departments.
I may not fully understand all of the questions that were wrapped into what you just said, but I'm at University of Wisconsin, so we deal with a lot of first-generation college students who come from rural backgrounds. So it is true that they come with certain kinds of life experiences that inform how they think about science. But I don't have any numbers. You know, I myself am a suburbanite. I grew up near Washington, D.C. in the Northern Virginia suburbs. That's not me, but I think, at least in the state of Wisconsin, we pay a lot of attention to the importance of helping students see that they could go into careers in science. There's a strong family pull if you live on a farm and you're part of a multi-generational kind of farming situation. So that's complicated. But you know, I think one of the foci of this discussion has been how do we help remove some of the disparities in education. This is an important question. I think that, and it may affect these discussions about the use of technology in the future in interesting ways. So at least at my institution, we think about this a lot. I don't know what the best answers are. It's complicated. I would say, I have a Navajo student in my lab, a PhD student is about to finish in biophysics, and what he has been through in terms of lived experience, is amazing, and I have difficulty even imagining his life before he came to our university, but he's a remarkable success story. So they're out there, but we have to continue working hard.
I think that there, certainly there's a lot of effort on outreach to students now about making sure that it's not just about memorizing like a set of 20 reactions to like put freshmen both in high school and freshmen in college through purgatory to like memorize the Krebs cycle, I think there's trauma immediately written on all of our faces. I've never used the Krebs cycle. Yeah, to teach, especially as we're confronted with the scientific illiteracy that's now. I mean, we just teach people to memorize a couple protein reactions, a couple chemical reactions, and then you're good to go. And I think now there is much more an emphasis on this is how you evaluate scientific literature. This is how you, that is not happening, I think, at your day-to-day public school, but there's huge efforts to be able to empower teachers and to get teachers sometimes into labs. I've met teachers who've worked summers in the lab. Yeah, I also think just like from my background, I think science can be a very liberating space as well. Growing up in the context I did, like the power tools were passed to other people. So then I went to a lab that built microscopes and they were like, yeah, you know, do it. So, you know, it was shop for girls, you know, when I went to college, which was so amazing, you know, where I had a ground to prove myself that wasn't, you know, gender specific. Yeah, and I feel like that hands-on, you know, it might not be blue collar, but the fact that I got to build things and, you know, use the organic materials of the earth, even if they were like cultured cell lines stored at -80. I mean, I think that's, yeah, it really, it can be a really empowering space too, provided you have the correct or the, you know, really good mentorship.
We'll let Mike ask.
Here.
Is there time for one more question? Yeah. First of all, Jeff, thank you so much. The presentation and it was remarkable. And to the panel, thank you. I have a favorite panelist, but that's my wife, Jeff, by the way. So Jeff, I'm going to try to make this a question. One of your slides said something like, scientists can't make these decisions about what we research and not research. That needs to kind of be society that does that. I was going to take a picture and you flipped before I got the picture, but it was something like that. Think about how does that work? And if that works, how does society express itself? Here's my question. Society expresses itself through elections, which makes everything political, which we're experiencing in our country right now. That's a problem. I would love to hear you make some comments about that, and then our panel to think about how can we, because I agree with that, but how do we do that without politicizing everything and making everything about an election? That's a big question, but thank you.
You're absolutely right. So, you know, I think these kinds of decisions can be depoliticized by involving people who transcend single presidential administrations or gubernatorial administrations. Francis Collins is a good example. So he served under Barack Obama and then Donald Trump and now Joe Biden. Now he's stepping down, but it is possible for those kinds of civil servants to transcend individual political administrations. And I guess it would be great to me if we had panels and commissions that are bipartisan in that way in our country. You know, our country is inherently bistable because of the way our government was set up in the beginning, right? And we're really a two-party system. We're not like Italy, right? So there are good things and bad things about that in terms of how our government works, for sure. I think in the US, we haven't done that great of a job of convening groups across multiple social strata to discuss these really huge, massive rock kinds of topics. We've not been good about that. And so then the average person feels the only way I can influence the process is through the ballot box. And because of the way our political system works, we've become progressively polarized over the last few years. You know, the middle has dropped out of our discourse. I myself feel like I'm a moderate, and I feel like I don't feel like my voice is out there somehow. And so I think it's possible. You know, there have been times in the past where, so there was a moratorium placed on genetic engineering of bacteria in the early days, when it was first realized you could engineer bacteria, and that involved voices from all across society that were convened by both the government and educational institutions. So, I mean, I would like something like that. Ben Hurlbut's idea of this genome observatory kind of process is basically he's calling on that to be convened. So just as young girls from Scandinavian countries can influence discussions about environmental policy worldwide, it ought to be true here too.
I think one of the things that's challenging is society, we only pay attention when we're absolutely enraged by something. You know, I think, I'm even just thinking about it, it's been a very bizarre experience for me to have trained in respiratory virology. Most of my funding for research has come through the NIAID, that's the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, which is headed by Tony Fauci. And it's been so bizarre to watch the people I've had lunch with and the people who've signed off on my grants suddenly be in the public sphere. And everyone's like, well, where did these people come from? And I'm like, well, they've been here. Like, you know, they're trustworthy to an extent. And it's like, well, it's not interesting until it's political. And I think it's until it affects your, you know, an identity. And I think that is also, I think scientists can only advocate for themselves to a certain extent because we come from a self-interested standpoint of being like, I want you to care about what I'm working on. There's, you know, I think it's important for us to care what other people are working on. There's a really comic I love that talks about the purity of the disciplines from XKCD that's like, you know, physics is just applied math, and then like chemistry is applied physics, and biology is applied chemistry. You can see where this is going. Medicine is applied biology. And there's just like, the mathematicians are like, we are the purest form. Yeah, and so I think there's just this, judgment about what's valuable, and people, I think, can feel maybe exploited when it's only the polarization from science that you want to pull. When it really is just like we're plugging in different bricks into this whole structure of how we as humans understand the world. You know, I think, and it's just, where do you want to find yourself on that spectrum? Do you want to find yourself on the like development of worms, which helps us like understand the development of humans? Do you want to be the oversight that looks at how a single institution is conducting that across a number of disciplines? Do you want to analyze it across the country? Do you want to apply it in that specific thing? Or do you want to think about how we as humans have like existed over history? That's another part, you know, like science is not divorced from all of these other fields. It's one specific application. You know, so there's like, how do we actually use that application? How do we preach about it? How do we teach our kids about it? How do we, just how is it shared throughout our communities? Just a general curiosity that all of these things are applicable to each other, and we each speak a specific language from our own experience and study.
I think also scientists haven't done a great job of utilizing the more modern tools of social media.
Like MySpace?
Yeah. The one before it, whatever that was. But I was at an infectious disease conference 2 years ago, and we were talking about vaccine development, and really the speaker was from California. I forget his name right now, but he showed us evidence of the anti-vax movement and all of the platforms that they've utilized versus the science movement, and like who's out there saying. And I wonder if part of it is that because we're scientists, and everybody took biology in high school. Everybody did, if they graduated. We just assume that there's a base knowledge, and obviously the base knowledge isn't enough to inform some of the stuff we're talking about today, right? The Human Genome Project is fascinating, but I don't know that it's accessible to lots of our non-scientists, and we're not doing such a great job of making it accessible. Part of it is me, I'll speak for myself. I tend to get impatient if someone doesn't understand it. And so we need to do a better job with that. We need to figure that part out. I also think there's a lot of media that our general population doesn't know how to sort, right? And so everybody my age does know how to use the media. I'm totally generalizing, but the younger folks aren't that great at sorting it. So they see it all, but it's overwhelming. And sorting it is actually something we haven't taught very well. There should be a class in high school, maybe instead of trig.
I don't want to steal more microphone time, but especially coming from the vaccine development side of things, have seen quite a few talks on like how to talk to people. I would assume you have too as a pediatrician, about talking to people about vaccine hesitancy. And I think one of the deepest things that we can do wrong currently is to be like, vaccines are either inherently completely dangerous or vaccines are always good. And it's really like vaccines are a balance of taking the less bad thing, of like causing an immune response in your body, over the worst thing. And so it really is a balancing of risk, and you pick which risk you want. And we obviously have agencies to evaluate that risk. We have the FDA, we have the NIH, who will not fund honestly, like the NIH funds the top 10% of grants. So there's lots of great ideas that have not been touched. I'm sorry, Jeff. And so I think teaching people to do that evaluation of risk, and to do that evaluation of like other people have a different risk tolerance. And then what do we collectively as a society? I think that's the big thing we're having right now is like, what will we tolerate risk-wise? And I think that goes to our inherent values as a society, and that's where we as a Christian community really have a place to also engage it, is what are our values and how do our values inform our risk tolerance?
Okay, so I'm mindful that we're now 30 minutes over and people have already had to leave. So I'm going to go ahead and draw it to a close, being mindful of the fact that it's a conversation that we just need to continue having. And one of the valuable parts about the conversations are to remind each other, Elizabeth, you were saying, these are not monolithic communities. And there's something about the more we engage in conversation, the more we see how things are not monolithic, and we start to see the nuances and we become better at conversation. So if you would join me in thanking our panel for being up here. And thank you for coming. And the next discussion will be January 15th, so keep your eye open for that. Okay, thank you. Have a great afternoon.